Welcome to another Lightblade Learning Lab. I hope today is going to be quite an interesting day because on the one hand I'm going to show you something quite interesting on this machine, but on the other hand what I'm going to tell you is please don't do it. Now that might sound dangerous, but it's not to me, but maybe just a little bit dangerous to the machine, and all will become evident as we get further into this little project. Now, as I told you before, I'm happy to do things on this machine to demonstrate to you things that you can't do yourself. Not entirely true in this instance, you can do it yourself, but the warning is that over the long term it might damage your machine. Not the tube, but the physics of the machine itself. So, let's just push on and you'll understand my love of this material. Acrylic. It's an amazing material. Now, as I've demonstrated to you many times before, it is unique amongst materials in that it does not burn. What it does, it sublimates. It turns directly from a solid to a gas when it heats up. We've got an invisible beam of light, which is just invisible energy. And what happens is, when the energy hits the surface of this material, that light energy turns to heat, and that heat immediately causes this stuff to evaporate. Now today I want to introduce you to a variant of acrylic. And I was recently visiting a local showroom of mine here in Colchester, a place called Colchester Worktops. Now that may well give you a little bit of a clue as to what we're going to talk about. I went there to visit to see if I could get some little bits of maybe offcuts of granite that I could use for demonstrating how we can engrave on granite. But that's not what we're going to do today. While I was there, they had lots of offcuts and samples of this wonderful material. Now you may well be familiar with this material already. It's a material called Corian, and it's used for worktops. Now, it is a mixture of about 30% acrylic, which is holding the whole thing together, but then it's been filled with various colours and types of aluminium oxide. Well, not aluminium oxide, it's aluminium hydroxide. And there's a big difference because aluminium hydroxide is used normally as a flame retardant. So it's got all sorts of properties that make it basically chemically inert to be suitable for use as work surfaces. Now, the fact that it contains 30% acrylic interested me because that raised the potential for being able to cut it on this machine and maybe engrave it on this machine. The only problem is the aluminium hydroxide that's in here is a solid which is not very good at transmitting heat or absorbing infrared light. So I was a little bit hesitant about trying to use it, but it had the possibility of being able to do something with it. So what I did was some quick test work to find out if we could cut it, and remarkably, I'm just about to show you some footage which shows you some results that I produced earlier on. Now we have two problems. Number one, the acrylic melts away nicely. Surprisingly enough, doesn't burn. what it does, oops, leaves all this dust behind, produces a nice clean edge that's not burnt. It's not particularly hot, but look, we've got all this dust, very fine dust, and that's going to be a killer. For these slides, which are covered in grease. So that's not going to do the bearings any good at all. So everything is getting in covered in a fine dust. We have to run incredibly slowly to cut. So here's the piece that came out of there, and here's an acrylic insert cut off the same file for there. Okay, well, I did warn you that that might be quite interesting. There's a couple of other things that I'd like you to just take a note of. Number one, you saw how bright the cut was. Tremendous heat in that cut. There was virtually no evaporation taking place that you could see of the acrylic. When you look on the edge of this material, it has got the merest amount of discoloration on it, and as you can see here, there is a small amount of discoloration in the bottom of these engraved cuts, but it's remarkably burn and debris free, considering I was blowing on it with a lot of air assist, and under normal circumstances air assist would make it very sticky and mucky on the surface here. So this is a very clean cutting material. Part of that property comes from the aluminium hydroxide. Now, the other thing I wanted you to note was that when I was cutting, the temperature on the back here, despite all this white heat that was on there continuously, this temperature on the back was virtually only probably 40 degrees C at the most. Now, why is that? No burns, cool cut. Well, it's all to do with this aluminium hydroxide, as I pointed out to you at the beginning. It's used as a flame retardant material. And basically what it is, the hydroxide part of it basically means that aluminium is bonded with water. When you heat it up, the water actually separates out, and that is that water which is producing the cooling effect. So it keeps the cut cool by basically converting the water into a coolant and leaving behind all that horrible dust, which is alumina. in this form you would normally recognise it as sandpaper or emery paper. It's a very hard material, and that's why we don't want that material on our slideways. Okay, so that's some of the interesting properties of this material. The other thing I'd like to point out to you is the weird errors and shapes that have occurred on these two G's here. Now, this one was done with a live download from the PC, and I've noticed this before, that once we start getting slightly complicated files, and this isn't a very complicated file, but once we're getting quite large files, what tends to happen is it seems as though the processor can't handle input information and output information at the same time, and it loses its datum position. As you can see, it's drifting all over the place. And even when I downloaded the file and held it on the computer, it was still doing this. The only time I had success with cutting and with engraving was when I loaded the file onto a memory stick and transferred the file into the machine via a memory stick. Now, this problem is not unique to this machine. I've seen it on my China Blue machine as well. Well, where do we go from here? We've got a machine that's full of abrasive dust and a fantastic material. One of the things I would like to try while we're working with this material is something that we haven't yet tackled, and that is 3D engraving. That's exactly what it sounds like. We're not going to cut to just a single depth as we did when we were doing this engraving. We're going to have variable depths across each one of our scans. So I think first of all we'll go away and take a look at the file that I'm going to be using for dealing with this 3D engraving, and then we'll come back here and we'll try and cut it. By which time, hopefully, I will have topped up my fuel tank again. Now, this is a specially prepared bitmap. It's not just an ordinary photograph. It's not something you can produce yourself. If we look at it carefully, it's got a very strange sort of waxy look to it. If we look at the top here, we'll see that there's white, and these little berries, look, they look white, and part of the eagle here is white. Well, in the background, we've got black. 0 is black, and white is 255. That's 256 colours in total. 254 of them are shades of black and white mix, i.e. grey. Now, the machine is actually capable of subdividing its power output into 256 levels as well, so that as it scans across here, while it's doing a scan, it can decide that this is full power, this is less power, and when we get to white, it's probably almost no power, and then it goes back to dark black, which is full power again. So as the beam moves across one sweep, it's continuously changing its power. So eventually we shall finish up carving this shape, because it's not something that happens instantly after just one pass. You have to do multiple passes to get the relief into this picture. Let's look up here at the bitmap handle, and we can see here that the resolution of this picture is 200 pixels per inch. When we look at the size of the picture up here, it's 61 millimeters wide, at 2.5 inches, and in 2.5 inches that means that at 200 pixels per inch there's about 500 pixels across that picture, and every one of those pixels is mapped when we create a file, and the computer is deciding what the power level should be at every step across. So it's quite a phenomenal piece of software engineering, to be honest. So we don't have to do anything with this bitmap handle at the moment. We could, if we wanted, change the, we do it gently, we can change the shade on the picture. We can play with that a little bit. Now the shades of grey on here are mapped onto here
off of a 3D object, so that they're basically like the contour lines on a survey map. Equal shades of grey are all at the same level, the depth in the picture. And that's how we get the 3D-ness into it. You do not get 3D if you just take an ordinary photograph and try and do 3D with it. So how do we get the 3D effect? So now we'll bring up the layer parameters, and this is where we've got to look very carefully at what we're doing. It is output, yes. Speed per minute, well, if you go too fast, the computer just can't keep up with the speed that we're going, and you tend to lose resolution in your picture. So I found that something like about 100 millimeters a second is a good speed to work with. Is it blowing? Well, certainly in this instance, yes. Depending on the material, we may make a different decision. Processing mode is scan, yes. This is where we're going to use something that we haven't talked about before, which is max min power. Now, the lowest power that the tube will fire at is around about 8%. So I'm going to set that to, I think, 9%. And that, well, choose a number. But the output curve is non-linear. And ideally what we'd like to do is make sure that we keep a linear relationship between all the colours in here. So always a compromise decision here. I think I'll probably start off at something like about 50% power. And what that means is that white will represent 9% and black will represent 50% power. And between those two numbers we've got 254 steps of power. Now the really important thing that you must do is to put that tick in there, output direct. Otherwise these two numbers will have no effect at all. X-swing, yes. So we've chosen a resolution of 200 dots per inch. So what I'm going to do is to do a very quick calculation to work out what the interval is. And that calculation is basically 25.4, which is 1 inch in millimeters. And we're going to divide that by 200, which is the resolution. And the answer to that is 0.127. And that's what we're going to put in this here, 0.127. So we've got 200 pixels across and 200 steps down per inch. Bear in mind I mentioned earlier that we had problems with transferring the file to the machine. What I'm going to do now is to save the file as a U file. So then we'll go out to the machine and load it into the machine.
Now bear in mind I was telling you how this didn't want to load properly. Well, I'm doing the same with this particular file. I'm making sure that I load it via a memory stick. And you can see how big the file is because it's taking absolutely ages to load. Well, I think it's probably going to be about 3 or 4 minutes by the time it's loaded. Now, I'm placing 2 of my very strong neodymium magnets on each corner. So I've got 8 magnets on here, pushed hard up against the corners, because I'm anticipating that because of the dust that's going to be produced and the fact that I'm going to have to do multiple cuts, I'm going to have to clean this in between the cuts, and I do not want this to move. Okay, now I've got the machine lid closed, but I have got an air gap underneath to let all the to let plenty of air flow through there. But of course this is producing a dust which probably doesn't get carried very far in the airstream. It gets blown away by the air assist, and that's because it's quite a heavy dust. Now if you listen, you can actually hear the beam changing its power. Now I'm afraid this is not exactly a rapid process. We're probably going to have to go over this maybe 4, 5 times, because this is actually still quite a hard material. The softer the material, the faster it cuts. Well, this is why I wanted to put the magnets on there, because we're going to have to clean all the dust off this job carefully before we go for the next cut, because this dust is not very absorbent and it will prevent the next layer from cutting. I've also increased the power this time so we get a bigger difference between our deep and our shallow cuts. You can probably just see here where it hasn't actually cut, and that's because that's where it was white. The darker parts are cutting just a little bit deeper. We'll have them cutting proportionately a lot deeper this time. Now I've moved the head out the way, but of course as soon as I press the start button it will go back to the original origin point that it was set to, and it will work from there. So the fact that I've moved the head out the way has not caused me a problem. So here we go, start. And now you can see we've got a much more violent cut. And I would say we're probably cutting on black maybe 1/2 to 3/4 of a mil deep. Now I have to say that I would not do this on my other China Blue machine because I don't have a proper air filtration system on there. On this machine we've got the Purex filter, which has got 4 levels of filter. I've got a crude filter inside the machine here, and then there's a pre-filter, a HEPA filter and an active carbon filter built into the Purex unit, and then it recirculates the air. I can hardly smell anything, but if I lift this lid there is a bit of a strange smell. Now I don't know exactly, although I've done some research, I don't know exactly what the gaseous products are when we are breaking down this aluminium hydroxide. Silica dust of any sort can cause respiratory problems, so that's another reason why I'm keeping this lid closed. Okay, well I'll move the head out the way again. And we can already see that we're beginning to get some nice shape into it. I could use an airline, but I don't want to blow this abrasive dust everywhere. I can even put the power up a little bit more to 70%. And if I want a deeper cut still, I can't increase the power anymore, but what I can do is decrease the speed. Well, this is going into our 4th cut now, and I think you can see that we're starting to get some pretty good relief. And hey, look at this. We're really getting some good definition into it now. Look, I reckon we might need 1 or maybe 2 more passes and then we should be there. I think what we might do is 1 more pass like that. Well, here we are after 5 cuts now. And hey, look at this. This is superb. This material is a wonderful material for 3D engraving. But I don't think we can handle the dust problem, so this may be my one and only attempt at 3D engraving with Corian on any machine. I think we should probably put a fine cut on there now, and we'll call that it. So let's change the cut to, we'll leave it at 8%, and we will change the maximum down to maybe 30%. Well, just while this is making its final cut, I've got some more rocket fuel, and I've got a solid fuel booster as well. And there we go. We will go and wash that under a tap and see whether we can maybe get a little bit more colour back into it, because it's probably covered in dust at the moment. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and we shall see you in the next session, where we might talk a little bit more about max and min. Cheerio for now.